sometimes my life mirrors scarily the topic on which I am preaching. And in the last few days, the phrase "dare to be an Esther" that I remember learning as a child has meant a great deal to me for different reasons. It is not always easy to dare to be an Esther. For all our getting ready, for all our getting set to be the people of God, to grow in our relationship with Jesus, to explore with childlike joy the gifts of the Holy Spirit, for all of that, the command to go is the sticky one. Because sometimes when you go, it works out not quite as you expect. The very act of going is an act whereby you relinquish control beyond the point of going. You might assume certain things, but you can never know for sure. And possibly that's why this third bit has ended up with me, because it's just the sort of the passion of my heart to enable us to get ready, to get set, so we can go. And I've really have enjoyed reflecting on Juliet's thoughts the past 2 weeks on the book of Esther, as she has so skillfully and spiritually drawn out the spiritual challenges in the book to get ready and to get set, whatever our circumstances and whoever we are. And as I said, today I'm bringing this 3-week reflection on what God is saying to us through this particular story to its close point for now. Now, like Juliet, I really hope that you have now read Esther's story in full, but you may be joining us having been away and not have a clue. And we will be sending out one of those lovely little Bible videos that gives you a great summary of it. If you're a visual learner, you know, that's a great way of getting to grips with a book. So that will go out with the "and another thing" material. The book is hugely dramatic. It's funny in parts, heavily ironic at times. But the thing that is speaking to me right now is it's just filled with so much tension and potential jeopardy. You can have the next slide. This is a quote from a Jewish scholar called John Levinson, and it's not appearing on the screen. There it is. He describes the book of Esther as a tale of intrigue at court and of lethal danger to the Jews, narrowly averted. A tale of the ascent of an orphan in exile to the rank of the most powerful woman in the empire. A tale of how a humiliated Jewish minority came to be respected and feared by the Gentile majority. And the comical story of a pompous, and I would want to add dangerous, fool, Haman, who eventually does himself in. Esther's story is celebrated each year by Jewish communities all over the world, and in Jerusalem for a whole extra day, just for good measure. With great relish, this story is celebrated. And if you read Esther, the last few verses are an instruction to celebrate the story of Esther every year. The celebration is because the evil lot that was to fall on them did not happen. It's one of those wonderful narratives where it's all going very bad. Then suddenly, by a miracle, the reverse happens. And actually, in chapter 9, verse 1, it's considered to be, by a lot of Bible scholars, as a very pivotal verse. The Hebrew says, Nahapok hu, which doesn't sound Hebrew to me, but I'm reading it phonetically. And that phrase means the reverse occurred. This was what was planned, but the reverse occurred. And I like that. That speaks a lot to me. The 2-day or 1-day Jewish festival is called Purim, and it literally means the festival of lots, which is relevant, as I will explain in a minute. And it's highly participatory. You're very fortunate that you haven't got a very loud rattle or a drum or a trumpet under your seat. Because when you do the story of Esther, particularly with children, you get them to join in, because part of the festival that people love is the story. The whole book is read out to the whole community in one go. There's a challenge to stay awake. So what they give everybody in the congregation, in the synagogue, or wherever it's being read out, they give them loud instruments, so that every single time the name Haman, the baddie, is mentioned, everybody goes, boo, and shakes and rattles and makes them. The idea is that you can't even hear this man's name anymore, because he's just been so squished. He's no more, and he lost, and it's all great. That's the idea. It's kind of like annually emphasizing a victory of sorts, isn't it? Please, every time I mention Haman, I know somebody's now going to be very tempted. Don't go boo every time, because we'll be here all morning if we're not careful. So, dramatic though it is, funny at times, often very ironic, and a deadly serious narrative, there are aspects of Esther's story and her context that for us are really hard to take. If you really, really take the book seriously, you have to acknowledge this. These are just some of the unpleasant realities that play a part in the culture and history against which the story is set. So the next slide, I'm hoping will come up, but if not, I'll read them to you. There you go. It's not hard to find illustrations of all of these things in the book of Esther: oppression, genocide, anti-Semitism, sexual exploitation, misogyny, I couldn't spell it, so I didn't put it up there, hatred, violence, vengefulness. There's a really ugly theme in this context. As we know, God is not mentioned. Juliet told us, and I think Tony knew this, that God is not mentioned anywhere in the book. And I really think this is a question worth asking. Why? Why is God's name not mentioned anywhere in the book? Do you know, it bothered the compilers of the Apocrypha, the books in the Bible that we don't tend to have. It bothered them so much that they rewrote the book of Esther. So if you've got a Bible with the Apocrypha, you've got 2 books of Esther in it. I don't know if you're aware of that. But the second book of Esther, or rather the first book of Esther rewritten, has got at least 50 plus references to God in it, and loads of prayers. It's like somebody thought, no, we can't have this book without the name of God. We need to put it in. I think the context, all of this, is possibly the reason why God's name is not mentioned. Because I think that the whole story of Esther works as a snapshot, a perfect image of what happens to the world, when we leave God out. That's what you've got. That's what happens to people. When you leave God out of life, these are the things that emerge out of people's hearts. For generations, as Juliet pointed out, the Persian kings had conquered nations, depopulating. Sound familiar this by any chance? Depopulating, destroying whole cities, and wiping out every aspect of the foreign culture that they were engaging with. And this terrible, evil strategy of dominance could come straight out of the How to Be a Dictator playbook, couldn't it? That's how they got to be the empire that they were. And it carries real resonance, doesn't it? As we look at human history over the years that we're aware of, and as we watch the news unfolding, we see this played out over and over again, don't we? So maybe that's why there's no place for God's name within the book of Esther, because the book urges us to reflect on what happens when a person or persons decide to ignore him, deny him, or play God themselves, or live outside his law. My friends, as I've had reason to experience recently, life lived without God, in opposition to God, and life that does not recognize the value of other human life is a very frightening thing, is it not? Do you know, if you can move this, you can't really see this slide, and it's so unfortunate. I think you can probably see it much better online. This is a picture of a tapestry. It's a beautiful medieval tapestry. And there are pins and needles in it because there's a hole in the tapestry that they're trying to kind of restore. And it really spoke to me, this image, because it made me think about how God's intended beautiful, wonderful purposes for this world are like a kind of beautiful tapestry full of richness, beautiful images, like a cosmic tapestry, if you like, beautiful in its design and its intention. But in reality, many dropped stitches, many holes made from willful disobedience and evil desires, rendering it all full of holes. And that's what we see playing out, a human story, a powerful human story against that kind of backdrop. Now, you probably are aware, I'm sure you are, the book of Daniel is another Bible story, excuse me. The book of Daniel itself is a similar kind of setting. It's set in the exile. And it's like Esther, it's an attempt to try and explore how to live faithfully under such foreign dominance in a foreign land. And then, in a sense, spiritually, that's exactly where we are we not? Scripture talks about us as being foreigners in a foreign land. In the world that's like this, our values just, they stand in absolute contradiction to this. But the story of Daniel is interesting because Daniel was an educated man, and he was given a high degree of autonomy and privilege in that particular story, certainly compared to that of Esther. Her life was not one which many of us would see as ideal in any way, shape, or form, was it? The account of how she, with many other women, is simply taken into the court to be used as property solely for the king's pleasure is actually hard to stomach, isn't it? The freedom to say no was not granted to any of those women. Esther was in a horrendous cultural trap that she could not get out of. So yes, she's beautiful and she's brave and she's bold. And yes, her decision to act on behalf of the Jewish people is unforced, it's selfless, it's sacrificial. And she could potentially have lost her life, as Juliet said last week. But she is nonetheless at every point, until that point, utterly dependent on men and having to accept her lot in life, unquestioning. Nobody questions this. This is reality. She's kind of passive in her fate. And in the story at the end, as we will see, that shifts. That reverses, that turns around. And this woman brought up in that kind of culture finds herself all powerful and able to bring down the king and the baddie, Haman. Boo, hiss, rattle, rattle. Okay, so from various standpoints, if we can have the next slide, to say that life under Persian rule was, well, pants, one of my favorite words, is a sort of understatement. So that's a picture a small part of some very, very soiled underpants. Lovely, they all say. The people of God went, ooh. Well, Jeremiah was asked to wear such a pair of pants, and you can check it out when you get home. And Jeremiah, I'm not going to read it now, Jeremiah 13, the first 11 verses. I'm not sure, Julia, if you're ever going to get into these kind of territories of prophetic enactment, but this was a good one. This is a bit of a stonker. Basically, Jeremiah is asked by God to wear a loincloth, which is biblical speak for pants, underpants, to wear them for a few days. I'm making no comment here on any male hygiene scenarios whatsoever. He's not even asked to turn them inside out or anything like that. And he's asked to go then and take them off and go and bury them in a really grubby, horrible place deep into the ground, and then leave them for a very long time. And then God says, you know those pants I asked you to bury ages ago? Go and dig them up and wear them. Put them on. He then goes to declare to the people that this is what they're like as far as God's concerned. This is who they are as far as God's concerned. His intent was for a pure, pristine, clean, intimate, close relationship with them. And what have they done? They've turned that into a pair of dirty pants. It's a very powerful prophetic image, isn't it? And that was the world in which Esther lives, and I would argue that in many regards, that's the world in which we live. The world as we see it and as we experience it often is clearly to us a world which has lost its way. And the lot in life, therefore, for many people across our planet reflects that lost spiritual identity and intimate relationship with the God, their Father and Creator. So that's an amazing background to factor into a decision to go and do what you know is the right thing to do, isn't it? Yeah? If we have the next slide, please. Esther's options were really limited. She makes a decision to go into the king to plead for her people because of the context in which she is. To me, that makes her actions all the more compelling. It's beyond bravery and courageous to me. And if you read the book, you know she didn't want to. This isn't some kind of, fake kind of course I will. It took some persuasion, some discussion, some consideration, a lot of prayer, and a lot of fasting. So as Juliet has said, in her preparation to go before the king, Esther again goes through the same process that she's already been going through. She gets ready. She makes herself ready in a way that sort of is culturally normative, but is also something that for the Jews was significant, because in her cleansing, in her purifying, she's also praying, and she gets the whole community to pray for her. And they're also fasting, because this is really significant. And I want to commend that thought to you. One of the things before we go that I think is really important is to perhaps revisit in our own lives what it might mean to pray and fast, what it might mean to get ready by cleansing and purifying in all the ways that Juliet said. Go back and listen to Juliet's last two talks. And then get set, making sure there's a balance in our lives between the core aspects of our being as human beings: body, mind, soul, and spirit. So Esther's story reminds us that all of this matters. It really, really matters. Getting set, being renewed in body, mind, soul, and spirit is his call on our lives. It's an inescapable call, because that's what he's going to ask us, what we have done with our lives. So getting ready for his coming, getting set that we can go out into the world, is a core part of who we are meant to be. So for those of you that have been away or missed one of the talks or haven't yet read the whole book of Esther, and for anyone online joining us for the first time, here's a just quick overview of where we've got to. So this bit, if you can remember it, or you can go sleep briefly. As we read last week, the king's second in command, Haman, is offended greatly when Esther's cousin and guardian, Mordecai, refuses to bow before him. So Haman plots to have all the Jews killed. Nothing like an extreme reaction, is there? Plots to have all the Jewish people killed, and he draws lots to determine the day and month that this should happen. I wonder how many times I've said lots in this sermon so far. The Jewish people's lot is going from bad to worse, and this is Esther's moment. She accepts Mordecai's plea that maybe all that has happened to her, good and bad, is for such a time as this. She got ready, and after 3 days of prayer and fasting, she was now set. All she had to do next was take up her courage and dare to approach the king without the customary invitation, accepting the terrifying possibility of her own execution as a result. Very recently, I have been quite literally assaulted for my faith in Jesus. It's never happened to me before. Sometimes when you go in truth, in justice and righteousness and peace, you get violence back. And never have I ever felt closer to those who face that day by day by day. So Esther approaches the king. Next slide, please. There's a delay on Ian's not asleep, it's the delay on the clicker. So she goes to the king. All previous enforced passivity and cultural context realities, they're all set aside. She goes, she steps out before the all-powerful king, facing her fear with a proactive determination and guts. Let's call it what it is. Sheer guts. I don't know what her guts felt like at the time, I can imagine, but she had guts, didn't she? Ready, steady, go. So we're going to hear the rest of the story now with a little bit of me in between. So Tina, I think you're going to read it, aren't you?
The reading is taken from Esther chapter 5 verses 1 to 4 and then from chapter 7 1 onwards. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for the king." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared.
So, lulled by Esther into a false sense of security, Haman is invited to this feast, yet another in the multiple numbers of feasts that happen in the book. Haman thinks he's made it. There he is with the king and the queen in the royal presence, just him. He goes home to celebrate this incredibly privileged status, and he makes ready the gallows upon which he intends to hang Mordecai, Esther's cousin, who has offended him. Meanwhile, this bit I love. I'm sure this has never happened to anyone in a meeting ever. The king is trying to get to sleep by having his own royal records read out to him. They must have been riveting. And he realizes, he's awake enough to realize that he hasn't rewarded Mordecai, because earlier on in the story, there's a little side bit of the story. Mordecai has overheard a plot to kill the king and told Esther to tell him, and thus save the king's life. But the story is repeated in the records, read out, and the king kind of wakes up and says, "What do we do for that man?" And the answer comes, "Nothing." So the king decides that he's going to really, really honor Mordecai for doing that. And I love it, because if you read that bit of the story, it's one of my favorite bits of the story, because the king asks Haman, what would I do with such a wonderful man who has been so amazing, but he never says Mordecai. He never says he's talking about Mordecai. What can I do to honor this man? And Haman goes, oh, give him a horse and royal robes and let him be second only to the king. Thinking, of course, that he's talking about himself. And then, of course, irony, humor in the story, it turns out that Haman has to go and honor Mordecai in that way. So I just love it. So there you are. The story continues. Tina.
So the king and Haman entered to feast and drink with Queen Esther. The king repeated to Esther what he had said on the previous day while drinking wine. What are you asking, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. Now, what is your request? Even if it is half of the kingdom, it will be done. Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, at my petition, let my life be given me, and my people at my request, for we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to be annihilated. If only we had been sold as male and female slaves, I could have kept quiet, for that distress would not be sufficient to trouble the king. Then the king answered and demanded of Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do so? Esther said, this wicked Haman is the adversary and enemy. Haman was seized with terror before the king and queen, and Haman was hanged on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai.
The moral of the story, don't upset a king, I suppose. Now, we've left lots out of the story, but you can see how this is a complete reversal of the lot that was supposedly to befall Esther and the people of Israel. The rest of the story is straightforward, if a tad violent, caught up by the rules that say the king's edicts can never be overturned. Bit of a problem there, isn't there? Esther suggests very, very cleverly that the king grants her and Mordecai permission to write a new edict in the king's name, giving the Jews a day each year when they had the king's authority to rise up and destroy any enemies who would ever come against them at any point ever. Of course, Esther and Mordecai choose the same day that Haman had got the king to say would be the day when people would rise up against the Jews and try and kill them. So they now had the king's authority and support of the king's forces to make sure that they couldn't get killed and they could then kill anyone who came against them. It's not surprising that Esther, the story, the book, records with some irony that the frightened people, the frightened Persians, were so scared of this decree that many started to claim to be Jews themselves. The Jews, as I say, celebrate every year this day when the lot had fallen in their favor. So, for Jewish people, Esther's story has been and still is all too real. I think it's also very interesting for us. How do you live a faithful life as a chosen, set apart, quite different child of God in a world which at best tolerates you and at worst actively seeks to destroy you, to wipe you out? This question is our question too. Setting aside all the uncomfortable realities of the story and the context, recognizing as Christians, we also face difficult and sometimes dangerous realities as a result of living in a godless world, until the fullness of God's kingdom comes, that is. So what does it mean for us in this context to get ready, get set, and go? The word go is an interesting word. Go. My response is always, where? Go where? Go when? Go what for? Go why? Esther had made herself ready, and she was now in the right place at the right time to go forward, to risk her life, to save her people. And my question is, what are we getting ready for? Getting set for? What does it mean for us as a church and as individuals to go? So I've got some pictures for you, which, of course, on this wonderful screen won't show up brilliantly, but you'll see them in all their glorious Technicolor online. There are various pictures there. The first one in the top left-hand corner is of a couple of young girls at the starting point of a race. Ready, steady, go! As no one ever said to anyone in their 80s. I read that online. I thought that was a very insulting thing to say. Anyway, the one in the far right, as you're looking at it, is a man in a very, very dark tunnel running towards the light. We don't know why, we don't know how, but we can imagine a backstory in which someone says, go, and he's running. The one in the bottom left-hand corner is that wonderful stop-go that we love to see on our roads. Stop, go, stop, go. Then you've got a goldfish jumping out of a rather full goldfish bowl into an empty goldfish bowl. I'm not sure who said go to him. It's an analogy, a metaphor, but you can work with it. And then in the middle, we very recently watched the film Sully, which is about the pilot who landed the plane what's the name of this river? The Hudson in America. Amazing film. And you've got all this image of the inflatable slides coming out of the plane and the crew going, go, go, go. I wonder if any of those pictures speak to you. So I'm going to ask you online to have a little conversation in the chats, and I'm going to ask you guys to sort of just turn your chairs around so that you can have a look at these and say, do you know, that really speaks to me. I don't really know why. Have a bit of conversation. If there's total silence, I'll consider it to be a Quaker, a couple of minutes, and that's fine. But just a couple of minutes. What, if anything, do any of these images say to you about this challenge from the book of Esther to go? What does it mean? What does your heart feel, your spirit feel, your body feel even when you look at this? What reactions do you have to God's command to go? Well, if you hit the slide, there's a kind of a biblical theme in the New Testament that is really powerful, and I think it produces some of these reactions as we read them. The use of the word go in the Great Commission, when Jesus says, go out into all the world and make new disciples from all nations, yeah? That bit in Matthew, the end of Matthew. The technical way in which you translate the go is as you go. It's a sort of forward continuous verb. So as you go, make disciples, and that's a picture of a match and then a row of other matches. And it's the domino effect concept that as you go, if your light impacts another person, that light can then impact another person, impact another person. So the very act of going is a counter to the ugliness of the world. It's light, it's cleanliness, it's purity, being caught almost naturally by people as they meet you and you share who you are with them. That's one image there. And then the other one is encourage one another as you go on the way. The first church didn't call themselves Christians or the church, they called themselves the way, followers of the way of Jesus. It's got a forward momentum to it, hasn't it? And it's as you go. It's this time tomorrow as you go. How are you going to step out into the fullness of what God has for you? How are you going to be a light? How are you going to be an encourager? How maybe are you going to be an Esther or a Mordecai or any other biblical character who might inspire you? What can you keep in your pockets, in your backpack, in your handbag, so to speak, spiritually, that will stand you in good stead from your preparation and your getting ready, getting set? What will help you as you go into the world that is without God and so desperately, desperately needs him, needs to be restored to its fullness? Let us say these words from Psalm 143 together. Show me the way I should go, for to you I entrust my life. Blessing of God, Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with you and remain with you always. Amen. We go in faith to love and serve the Lord. Amen.